Day 27. The interior temperature of the rock held at 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature at the mouth of the shelter, 2 feet behind the waterfall's frozen curtain, was 9 degrees. Outside, the blizzard had not stopped for 3 days. The wind produced no sound that could be identified as wind. It was a constant, low-frequency pressure against the mountain. Agnes noted the new information on the wall with a piece of charcoal. 27 vertical lines, for diagonal slashes through them, and 2 more lines. Firewood remaining, for cords, stacked by density, driest birch closest to the hearth. Dried meat, 88 strips, hanging from a line stretched between 2 rock pillars. Tallow rendered, 12 pounds in 3 clay pots. The golden retriever, Saul, slept by the fire, his flank rising and falling with a rhythm that matched the slow pulse of the heat. He was a living measure of warmth. The shelter was a system, and the system was working. They had expected her to die within a week. Rewind. The accusation was simple. The Monroe Company strongbox was gone. Inside it was the payroll and the settlement's emergency fund. A debt note for an impossible sum, signed with her late husband's forged signature, was found in her cabin. Franklin Monroe, the patriarch's son, made the discovery. He held up the paper for all to see. His voice was loud, certain. Mr. Hewitt, the settlement administrator, looked at the paper, then at Agnes. He saw a widow with no connections and a man with a powerful father. The equation was simple. He did not look for other answers. Theft is an expulsion, Mr. Hewitt said, his voice flat with the tedium of authority. You have until sunrise. No one spoke for her. To speak for her would be to speak against Monroe. Debt was the true law of the settlement, and Mr. Monroe held every ledger. Agnes packed what she was allowed, a bedroll, 1 pot, a flint and steel, a knife, an axe, and a small bag of flour and salt. She did not argue. Arguing was an expenditure of energy. She walked out of the settlement as the sun touched the eastern peaks, heading not for the southern trade roads, but north, into the high wilderness. Saul trotted silently at her heel. The lowlands were a trap. They would be watched, and survival there was a matter of charity she would not be given. The high country was honest. It would either kill you or let you live on its own terms. For 5 days, she walked. She rationed the flour. She and Saul hunted rabbits, eating them raw to conserve the energy of fire-making. She was looking for a specific geological formation her husband had described once, a fault line where water forced its way through granite, creating overhangs and deep crevices. On the 6th day, she found it. A waterfall, narrow and high, cascaded down a sheer rock face. Even in the growing cold, a thin plume of vapor rose from where the water struck the rocks below. A temperature differential. Something was warmer behind the water. She left her pack with Saul, commanding him to stay. The rock beside the falls was slick with ice, but the stone directly behind the curtain of water was merely wet. She found a gap, a vertical fissure no wider than her shoulders. It was dark. She could feel a faint, steady draft of air coming from within, not the swirling gusts of the outside, but something constant. A system breathing. She squeezed through the opening, scraping her coat on the rough stone. The sound of the waterfall became a deafening roar, then, as she moved deeper, it subsided to a dull, omnipresent thunder. The air was still and cold, but not freezing. It smelled of wet stone and deep earth. Saul whined from outside the crevice. "Here," she called. Her voice was small in the space. He pushed his way through, his body a warm, solid presence in the blackness. She struck her flint. The first spark illuminated a narrow passage that sloped gently downward. The second spark caught the tinder she had kept dry in a waxed pouch. The small flame revealed walls of solid granite, smooth and dark. The passage continued for 20 feet, then opened into a space she could not measure with the small light. She lit a dry branch from her pack and held it aloft. The flame showed a cavern. It was not vast, but it was large enough. The ceiling was high, maybe 30 feet, and arched like a cathedral nave. In one corner, a steady trickle of water ran down the wall into a clear, stone-bottomed pool. Clean water. On the far side, a pile of rubble lay beneath a dark fissure that snaked up the rock wall toward the ceiling. She held the torch near it. The flame bent inward, then straightened, pulled by a steady draft. A chimney. A natural flue to draw smoke. This was not just a cave. It was the foundation of a house. Her first task was fire. She gathered the driest pieces of wood from the deepest parts of the cavern, ancient branches that had fallen and seasoned in the dry stillness for decades. She built a small pyre directly beneath the fissure. The smoke rose, hesitated, then flowed up and out of sight. No smoke filled the cavern. The system worked. She and Saul sat before the small fire, the first real warmth in a week. She added more wood. The light pushed the darkness back, revealing the full extent of her new world. It was a single, large chamber with several smaller alcoves branching off. In one alcove, she found a deposit of dense, grey clay. She took a handful. It was pliable. Bricks. Mortar. A fireplace. She began to plan. Back in the settlement, the first snows fell, dusting the muddy street in a coat of deceptive white. Franklin Monroe walked with a new swagger. He had solved the problem of the missing funds, identified the culprit, and cast her out. He was the town's protector. He bought rounds of drinks at the saloon, paying from a thick roll of bills. He spoke often of his father's business acumen, and how he intended to expand their interests. Mr. Hewitt watched him, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The story was too neat. The evidence too convenient. But to question it now was to admit his own judgment had been flawed from the start. He chose silence. Mr. Monroe, the patriarch, remained in his office behind the general store. He said little about the incident, but he watched his son's profligate spending with an accountant's cold gaze, noting every expenditure in a private ledger. Meanwhile, the practical consequences of Agnes's absence began to surface. The community's winter stores, usually organized and inventoried by her meticulous hand, were in disarray. No one knew the exact count of flour sacks or salted pork barrels. Mrs. Gable, who did the laundry for the Monroe household, found something in the pocket of Franklin's trousers. It was a small, carved wooden bird, painted with a level of detail she had never seen from local craftsmen. It felt foreign. She looked at it, then at the Monroe house, and a thread of suspicion began to form. She wrapped the bird in a cloth and hid it at the bottom of her sewing basket. The town was colder, not just from the weather, but from a subtle, creeping inefficiency. Things were not where they were supposed to be. The system was breaking down. Agnes worked. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity. The first project was the fireplace. The open fire was inefficient, consuming wood too quickly and allowing most of the heat to escape up the flue. She needed to capture and radiate that heat. For 3 days, she hauled flat stones from the rubble pile at the back of the cavern. She used her axe to break larger stones into manageable sizes. She carried water from the seep pool to the clay deposit, mixing the clay with sand from the pool's edge until it had the consistency of thick mortar. She laid the first course of stones in a U-shape around the base of the natural chimney. Each stone was set in a bed of wet clay. The work was slow and precise. She built the walls up, creating a firebox 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. She angled the back wall forward to direct more heat into the room. At the top, she built a mantelpiece from a single long, flat slab of granite. It took her an entire day to move it into place, using smaller logs as rollers. When she was finished, she stood back and examined her work. It was rough, but it was functional. She built a small, hot fire in the new hearth. The stone absorbed the heat, and soon, a steady, radiant warmth filled the main cavern. The temperature rose by 10 degrees. The system was improved. Next, the bed. Sleeping on the cold ground, even with a bedroll, leached warmth from her body. She gathered fallen limbs of pine and birch from a sheltered grove near the waterfall's base. She used her knife to cut notches, lashing the logs together with cordage she made from fibrous inner bark. The result was a raised platform, a foot off the stone floor. She spent a day gathering pine boughs, weaving them into a thick, aromatic mattress. That night, she and Saul slept on the platform. The difference was immediate. She woke feeling rested, not stiff and cold. On the smoothest wall of the cavern, she made her first entry with a piece of charcoal. Day 8. Fireplace complete. Bed complete. Temp 45°F. The improved shelter was a stable base of operations. Now she needed to secure a food supply. The flour would not last forever. She had been allowed to keep her husband's snare wire. She spent a day scouting the terrain around the waterfall, looking for game trails. She found them, faint paths used by rabbits and grouse. She set her snares, 10 of them, along the most promising runs. She used her knowledge of the animals, placing the wire loops at the precise height to catch a rabbit's head, anchoring them to saplings with a tension that would kill quickly. The first morning, she checked her lines. 3 rabbits. She brought them back to the cavern, skinned and butchered them with practiced efficiency. Nothing was wasted. The pelts were scraped clean and set to dry. The meat was cut into thin strips. The bones and offal were boiled into a broth for Saul. She built a small smokehouse in one of the alcoves, a simple stone box that channeled cool smoke from the main fire over the strips of meat. Within a week, she had a growing supply of jerky. She foraged for what the season still offered: tough, starchy cattail roots from a nearby marsh, pine nuts harvested from cones she broke open with a rock, and a handful of rose hips, rich in vitamins. Her tools were her knife and her axe, but she needed more. Using a sharp piece of flint, she began carving a large, fallen piece of birch. First a spoon, then a shallow bowl. The repetitive motion of carving focused her mind. Each scrape of the flint was a mark of progress. The inventory of her world grew, not with possessions, but with solutions. On the wall, the charcoal ledger expanded. Day 15. Snares, 6 active. Rabbits, 11. Meat dried, 3 pounds. Pelts, 11. The wall was her record, an unadorned account of survival. It was an argument written in numbers and facts. The blizzard hit the settlement with punishing force. Snow piled in drifts that buried doorways. The wind tore shingles from roofs. Inside their cabins, people huddled around fires that gave off more smoke than heat. The wood Franklin had ordered delivered was green and poorly seasoned. It sizzled and sputtered, a constant, frustrating battle for warmth. The roof of the main storehouse, which Agnes had inspected and marked for repair weeks before her expulsion, began to fail. A slow drip became a steady trickle, soaking through sacks of flour and cornmeal. The damp spread, and with it, the threat of mold and rot. Mr. Hewitt saw the store spoiling and felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. He confronted Franklin. "The wood is useless. The storehouse is leaking." "You were supposed to oversee this." Franklin, cornered, grew defensive. "It's the storm. No one could have prepared for this." The men who stacked the wood were lazy. He deflected, shifted blame, his words coming fast and unsupported by fact. His father, Mr. Monroe, watched the exchange from his office doorway, his face an unreadable mask. The system of the town, built on his credit and Franklin's hollow authority, was being tested and found wanting. Shaw, the old trapper, arrived in town, his snowshoes making the only tracks in the street. He had come for supplies. He listened to the muttering in the saloon, the stories of the spoiled food, the useless firewood, and the casting out of the widow. He asked a few quiet questions. He learned she had gone north. "Fool's direction," one man slurred. Shaw shook his head slowly. "Not for someone who knows the mountains," he said. "It's where you find granite shelves and deep cuts." She'd look for shelter, not an escape route. He bought his salt and tobacco and left, his quiet observation hanging in the smoky air like an unanswered question. The leak in the storehouse office became a serious problem. Mr. Hewitt, desperate to save the settlement's records, the ledgers of debt and credit that formed the town's true constitution, began moving the heavy books and wooden crates to the drier side of the room. He strained to shift a large, forgotten crate of mining equipment. As he dragged it away from the wall, he saw something wedged in the gap between the rough-hewn planks. It was the Monroe Company's strong box. It was caked in dust and cobwebs, clearly having been there for some time. The lock had been smashed, the lid pried open with brutal force. It was empty. For a long moment, Mr. Hewitt stared at it, the implication settling like ice in his gut. The office was his private domain. Agnes had never been inside it. He called for Mr. Monroe, then for Franklin. When Franklin saw the box, a flicker of pure panic crossed his face before he could control it. "She must have put it there," he blurted out, his voice an octave too high. "She hid it before she left, to make me look bad." The excuse was too quick, too elaborate. An innocent man would be confused. Franklin was defensive. At that moment, hearing the commotion from across the street, Mrs. Gable felt a certainty settle upon her. She retrieved the small, carved bird from her sewing basket. She did not go to Mr. Hewitt or the Monroes. She went to Shaw's cabin on the edge of town. She showed him the bird. Shaw turned it over in his gnarled hands. "I know this work," he said, his voice low. "Comes from a German carver down in the capital. I saw a man buy one just like it last month. Paid with a Monroe Company bank draft. Complained his son had debts he needed to cover. The pieces connected with a quiet, damning click." Shaw did not act with haste. He was a man who understood systems, both of the wilderness and of men. He took the wooden bird and went directly to the elder Mr. Monroe's office. Mr. Hewitt was already there, the empty strongbox on the floor between them. Shaw placed the small bird on the desk without a word. He recounted the story of the carver, the bank draft, and the talk of a son's debts. Mr. Monroe looked from the bird to the box, then to Mr. Hewitt. The evidence was circumstantial but interlocking. It formed a picture of logistical reality. Franklin could have accessed the office. Franklin had unexplained money. Franklin had a motive. Franklin was the only person whose story required believing the impossible. Mr. Monroe sent for his son. Franklin entered the office, saw the three men and the two pieces of evidence on the desk, and his composure shattered. The lies fell away, replaced by a torrent of panicked confession. Gambling debts to dangerous men. He had taken the payroll, planning to replace it after a sure bet, which he had lost. The forged note was an act of desperation, a way to create a plausible suspect. He had chosen Agnes because she was alone, because she was meticulous with numbers and could be framed as clever enough to pull it off. In the main room of the general store, Mr. Hewitt stood before a gathering of the town's cold and anxious citizens. He told them the truth. He did not spare himself. "I did not investigate," he said, his voice heavy. "I accepted the easiest explanation because it was convenient. The fault is mine." There were no shouts, only a deep, weary silence. The injustice was now a known quantity. Shaw stepped forward. "She went north," he said. "I'll take 2 men. We're not going to rescue her. We're going to deliver the news and ask her pardon." Shaw knew how to read the land. He did not look for a person, he looked for the signs of a system. He looked for cut branches, for displaced stones, for the faint disturbances that indicated a thinking creature was moving with purpose. He found Agnes's trail, faint after weeks of snow, but logical. It followed high ground, conserved energy, and moved toward defensible terrain. After 2 days, he and his men saw the waterfall, a great pillar of ice in the winter sun. And from behind it, almost invisible against the grey rock, rose a thin, steady plume of white smoke. They did not approach with caution. Shaw called her name. "Agnes." The sound was swallowed by the landscape. He called again. A figure emerged from behind the ice curtain. She was not gaunt or ragged. She wore a coat of stitched rabbit pelts over her clothes. Her face was thin, but her eyes were clear. Saul stood beside her, watchful but not aggressive. Shaw stopped 20 yards away. He told her everything. He recounted Franklin's confession and Mr. Hewitt's public admission. He spoke plainly, without emotion, delivering the facts as he would a weather report. Agnes listened, her expression unchanging. She showed no elation, no anger, no desire for revenge. The facts were simply new data to be entered into her system. When he was done, she nodded once. "The shelter is sound," she said. It was not the response they expected, but it was the truest statement she could make. Her survival was not an emotional victory, it was an engineering one. They offered her passage back to the settlement. She looked at the cave, then back at them. "I will consider it," she said. Weeks later, after the blizzard broke and travel became easier, Mr. Monroe made the journey himself. He followed Shaw's directions to the waterfall. He squeezed through the narrow crevice and had to bow his head to enter the main cavern. He saw the world his son's lies had inadvertently built. The neat stacks of wood, the orderly rows of dried food, the tools carved from wood and stone, the faint scent of pine and clean smoke. And on the wall, the charcoal ledger, a precise, unemotional record of work and existence. He offered her the position of settlement quartermaster, with a salary and full authority over all stores and preparations. She looked at the numbers on the wall, a history of her own competence. "Yes," she said. The final image was not of her return. It was of the cavern, empty of people. The fire in the stone hearth burned low. On a peg driven into a crack in the rock hung a new, warm woolen coat. And on the wall, the charcoal lines remained, a permanent, silent testament. Day 1. Day 27. Day 84. The record outlasted the accusation. The system she built had become a part of the mountain,